should all see my screen, and again, I'll look to Selena for a head nod. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's talk about bullying and autism for about 30 minutes, and then the rest of the time we can kind of discuss. I want to start out with being on the same page about what bullying researchers typically reference as an accurate definition, lay definition of bullying, of relationship problems that are recurring, that typically involve aggression of some sort, and that have a power imbalance. So the first thing to think about when we talk about bullying is that bullying, or peer victimization, as it's often talked about in the literature, is not a one-way situation. It requires a relationship. You don't bully as one, and it often requires more than two people involved, or often involves more than two people. And it always involves some aspect of a power imbalance. Now, that power might be social status, it might be physical size, it might be attractiveness, it might be disability. There are so many ways that we can experience and exert power or lose power in relationships, but there's a power imbalance at some point. A big question that often comes up around the autism bullying conversation is, how do you distinguish between harmless teasing and bullying? And it is confusing, and it's not a super clear, easy way to distinguish. But one thing that we often talk about is intent. And that's really hard for some people to figure out. Which makes sense that it would be even harder to ascertain, is this a bullying situation? But often there involves an intent to harm, emotionally, physically, to harm one's social successes, to harm one's academic or workplace achievement. The idea is that there's an intention there to hurt in some ways. Now, that in young kids, perpetrators of bullying might not be consciously thinking about harming others, but the intention is there nonetheless within the behaviors. I'm not going to go into a lot about rates of bullying and autism, because when you look across the studies, it varies tremendously, and there are so many different nuanced aspects to why rates look the way that they look. Suffice it to say that one has to consider the type of bullying we're looking at, whether it's all types and you're just saying, has this person been bullied? Or if you're asking specifically about different types like cyberbullying or physical aggression. Sometimes it depends, rates vary depending on the duration of that you're asking about. Did you ask, did this happen only once, or is this a regular occurrence? As well as duration of length, has this been happening for over a year? Or, are we talking about the last month, or a lifetime occurrence matters? The context, if we're trying to ask about school versus outside of school, for example, who we're asking. Parents typically report higher rates than, for example, teachers or school professionals, and often higher rates than autistic people when you inquire specifically with them, except for some literature around autistic adolescents, as well as disability level. So thinking just categorically around rates for autism versus not, or rates of disability versus not, really loses an important nuance that when we do dives into any particular diagnostic group, not just autism, what we find is that there's a lot of variability, and disability level or support need level, or however you characterize it, is an important moderator of these kinds of numbers. So it's important that we don't have a kind of a gross swath across what we're taking away to say all experiences of bullying for autism is the same just by definition of the label of autism. But ultimately, one of the take-homes that I'd like to share, and this is something that Deb Pepler taught me, and she's really a bullying expert. If somebody is a bullying expert, I would say Deb Pepler is. So she taught me, the important message is that bullying is actually not the problem for the victimized, for the victim of bullying, but it's a relationship problem. And it requires solutions in relationships. If we only think about addressing bullying by working with or on the victim of the bullying, we're not actually going to have the effects that we want to achieve when it comes to addressing peer victimization. It's an important component, but it's not a sufficient component. We really need to consider the perpetrators. In fact, people who are victims of bullying are often children, often perpetrators of bullying as well. In our research around bullying and autism, when we ask parents, at least, to talk about both experience behaviors around victimization and perpetration, approximately half of those youth who were reported to be experienced bullying actually were also endorsed as perpetrators of bullying by their parents. So we're not going to get into, I'm not going to get into a lot of the working with perpetration today. I think a lot of people probably signed on expecting that we're going to be talking about victimization. But it's important to know that, and it's important not to, it's not about good versus bad. It's not about, this is about children who are experimenting with and observing other people use power in relationships and are learning from that over time, learning from others. And so we have a duty when we're talking about addressing bullying to consider how we support perpetrators of bullying, both because of their own experiences probably of victimization and of being on the other end of that power imbalance, as well as to help them develop more healthy relationships in general. So there are typical kind of standard types of bullying that often are measured. Cyberbullying now, probably more than any other type, is talked about and so prevalent in terms of, and so important to consider in our social distanced world, physical bullying, verbal. But there's two types that Carol Gray has long talked about that I find really resonates with families and autistic people. The first is what she described of as backhanded bullying. So this idea of really these what on the surface look friendly, but they're really kind of gestures that bring in a vulnerable child, for example, and then the kind of it actually exploits them. So a good example might be on the playground, kid walking up to another child and being like, hey, it's good to see you, friend. Shake my hand. Hey, we shake hands because friends shake hands, right? And which 8-year-old do you know walks around shaking hands with his friends? They don't, right? Not typically, right? So, but if you're not if you don't have a social radar and you're not paying attention to that, your spidey sense isn't going to go off. Your social sense of something's off here. So you might go to shake that person's hand and they might grab it and squeeze it really hard and shake it really hard. And other kids might laugh, the bystanders might laugh around, right? So there's this kind of subtle bullying happening. But then how does that child who experienced that report that? What did the other kid do wrong? He shook my hand. I'm really upset because he shook my hand and other kids smiled. Right? So it's this kind of backhanded experience. And the other one is using absurd requests, essentially. So an example that one family shared is their kid got suspended from taking the bus home from school because the kid on the bus said, let's play a game. And wanting to connect and wanting to be involved, this child said, sure, what's the game? Well, it's going to be shirts and skins, right? And then it's about like holding our breath. So the two teams are going to be shirts and skins, and you'll be part of the skins. So what you have to do is you have to take your clothes off, right? Take your shirt off, and the shirts keep their shirts on. You know, like when you're doing like football, and some kids might, but that's not an appropriate place to do that. To take your shirt off, your shirt, and then your pants off on the bus, right, on the school bus. But this child went, well, okay, that makes sense because we're going to play this game. And as a result, ended up getting kicked off the bus. And all the other kids are laughing, and it's this highly shameful experience because nobody else is doing it too. So these are two other kind of types that if I'm debriefing with a family about experiences of bullying, I usually share those examples that I just shared with you. And then that usually resonates. Oh, there was this time X, Y, and Z. I want to talk 2 slides on risks. The first on individual risks. The 2 that are most common that we see are as moderators, or what place children with autism at risk, are that in terms of, there's been a lot of work looking at intellectual level, and there isn't a great linear correlation with intellectual ability, but it's more nuanced than just those with high IQ or those with low IQ, for example. It looks like the pattern is that those at the greatest risk are those who have at least average intellectual functioning, but also have high levels, relatively high levels of social communication impairment. Not necessarily high levels of restricted and repetitive behaviors per se, right? But on a social communication dimension. So those kids who are severely affected cognitively, and by virtue of that also struggle with lots of social communication impairment don't seem to be as high a risk for chronic bullying as these other kids. And there's a lot of different ways of looking at it, but that's a take home. And we see this, again, it's not actually autism specific. And there are, I don't need to show you rates, there are much higher rates of victimization in autism, whether we're looking at school-age youth, high school, or even adults, than in the general population. But this story of increased risk is actually a story of neurodevelopmental difference more than it is around autism specifically, where when the few studies that have compared across diagnostic categories seem to find very high rates, or higher than typically expected rates, whether you're looking at children with special education needs, children with learning disabilities, children with intellectual disability, or children with autism. There are some obviously nuances in there, but that's a take home. Another major risk factor is the presence of externalizing conditions in the child. So again, across neurodevelopmental conditions, those who have more aggression or aggressive behavior, those who have more conduct problems, those with ADHD or executive functioning difficulties are typically at greater risk of peer victimization. And those with anxiety disorders and depression or depressive symptomatology. So again, that's consistent, and actually that's the same for kids without neurodevelopmental conditions too. A really important moderator of victimization is not the individual, it's the peer group, and it's the presence of peers. So a very important factor that dictates chronic bullying is the lack of inclusion, successful social inclusion, and connectedness in an individual to a peer group. And it doesn't mean they have to be the most popular kid in school or in the classroom, but a degree of mattering to your peers is an important dictator of whether perpetrators are going to continue to perpetrate bullying. Okay. I can't overemphasize the importance of the audience and the bystanders, the interveners, to stopping bullying. Far more powerful than any adult, or far more powerful than anything the child who's the victim might do. Right. So here's some other quotes that I've paraphrased from Dr. Pepler, and I've heard her say a number of times in talks on bullying, and they're quite powerful to me. When peers intervene, bullying stops within 10 seconds over half of the time. Or peers are present the majority of the time when bullying occurs in the classroom or on the playground. Right? So these are not, the typical situation is not one where there's a bully and a victim, a perpetrator and a victim alone in a classroom, and this is happening. It's happening often in group situations. So if we're really going to address bullying and autism, we need to figure out ways of addressing the bystanders. And part of that has to do with ways of answering the question, how do we foster connectedness among the youth in that or that individual within that context, whatever context the bullying is happening in. And if you can do that, that's going to be a powerful intervention. So what works more broadly for bullying? I wanted to share a few things. There have been a number of systematic reviews that have kind of brought together what are the effective strategies to address perpetration or bullying. And the most important aspect that comes about time and again is improving the climate in which the bullying is occurring. That's why even the title of this, I tried to work the word context in there, because addressing the context, not working on the individual, seems to be the most effective, consistently effective set of strategies. And there's no one thing. So often bullying happens in school, and so there's a whole set of school initiatives or classroom initiatives, or what they call teacher-related factors, including helping teachers model healthy discipline. So there is some literature outside of the autism field to indicate that the adult in the classroom who holds the power, if they use aggression, if they use kind of yelling and other kinds of behaviors to control and to maintain the power, that actually is an unhealthy message to share with the youth in that classroom. So it's about actually correcting the kind of discipline strategies that teachers might be employing. But beyond that, you can see some of the other ones here around rules and kind of classroom management. Of all of the different strategies that you've been looking at on this slide, the most singularly predictive, effective strategy is of parent training. of how to support parents to support their youth who are experiencing bullying victimization or who are perpetrators of bullying. So supporting the parents and how they talk to their kids. And there's a number of different parent training kind of groups and literature around how to talk to your child about bullying. And I'll share you a few links at the end of the presentation that are good next places to read about materials that could be provided to families. A few other things around disability broadly, not autism specific, but that are important takeaways. One is probably the most important one is increasing the positive experiences of contact for children with disabilities to the broader peer group. There is something to be said about a meaningful contact hypothesis and ensuring that one's attitudes, explicit and implicit attitudes about difference and disability, are shaped in an accepting way. Right? The more shameful disability is, the more hidden disability is, the more excluded disability is, the less likely peers and the climate is going to be one that's going to address bullying when it starts. We're never going to actually be able to stop some experiments of bullying happening. That's like trying to put your finger in cracks in a dam. The most important way of shoring up the dam is to create a climate where when kids experiment with bullying, it's shut down. Okay, that's rather than encouraged and reinforced. There's a lot of material that suggests that indirect kind of teaching about how to address and how to comport oneself, like through books and videos, can be helpful. And there was a great study that I'll highlight for you here. This was a qualitative study that interviewed 36 autistic teens who had experienced bullying and asked them, how do you cope with bullying that's happened to you? Right? And they went through it. There's a bigger model than this in this Humphrey and Seams kind of article. But the most important takeaway for me was the things that they said worked for them and the things that didn't work for them. So as teens talked more about being able and comfortable to seek support in teachers, in peers, or in parents, as they felt like they had a way of assertively responding to the bullying, and an adaptive way of responding behaviorally to the bullying. So, if somebody bullies, I can, flip over the table and show this kind of reaction to experience being laughed at. But that really is going to encourage more of it. That's not a very adaptive response. But if I figure out, and if I have an adaptive way of shutting them down and walking away, right, that seems to be helpful. But most importantly, from the teen's perspective, it's the belief that they can be effective in changing their situation, and the belief that there are social influencers in that environment who will advocate for them. Okay, out of all of the kinds of strategies or things, so being able to connect a person to a peer leader, being able to find those kind of youth who have a lot of moral kind of development, who are aware of and comfortable with sitting next to somebody and putting their arm metaphorically around that other person to say, don't worry, you're with me, right? And I'm going to actually do something about this. This is not cool. Right? And also being able to feel like they have a way of getting out of that room. They have a way out or an option, a window is open to them to actually talk to somebody. Those are the most important kind of strategies to help them cope with experiences of victimization. I've seen this in my practice when I'm counseling youth, where the pain is not the actual victimization that they're experiencing, that one event that they're talking about to me. It's the fact that they don't feel heard or listened to, that nobody's responding to this in a way that they perceive as meaningful, right? That really is like the secondary trauma that perpetuates the pain that they're experiencing. And in contrast, the belief that one has to go it alone is a major kind of unraveling or a risk factor to ongoing negative sequelae associated with bullying. And you can think of all the things that one would have to do to lead to these greens or to avoid these kinds of reds. It's important that there's a developmental process here. Carol Gray mentions a number of autism specific myths that I love to kind of mention. And I share this with families or with professionals when we're talking, or I pay attention to them if they're in the conversations around bullying, if we're having team meetings. So one is that because a person has autism symptoms, yeah, you know, there are higher rates. You know, that sucks, but it's going to happen. You know, that's a myth. You know, they don't deserve to experience the bullying. And another important myth to distinguish is that the content of the bullying is the reason for the bullying. Just because, you know, somebody loves to talk about plumbing all day does not mean that that's why they're being bullied, even though that might be the content of the bullying. Hey, there's the plumber coming. You know, hey, how you doing, plum plum? Right? Actually, I don't know anybody who's ever bullied somebody by saying plum plum, but I think you get the gist. The idea of the real reason for the bullying is what we've already talked about here. This lack of connection, this stigma associated, this lack of tolerance of difference, regardless of the content, right? And the power imbalance. The content versus, so this is an important one to distinguish content versus process. Another one is that children need to, you know, suck it up and deal with it themselves. That's the only way to create strong individuals, or the only way that they're going to learn. Another myth is that anti-bullying programs. Oh, so for that example, this happens a lot. A major strategy as well, or a suggestion is, well, you need to stop talking about plumbing as much, right? And then the bullying will go away, and it won't go. That's not the kind of, that's a strategy that's essentially bound to fail, right? More than it is going to help. So that's what that third one is. Anti-bullying programs are important, but in and of themselves, those standard programs aren't going to be as effective as the things we've talked about. And our last myth is that increased supervision is going to solve the problem. Supervision is important for all kids, of course, right? We're not sending kids out for a Lord of the Flies kind of situation. There's a reason for adults to be present and to structure experiences and interactions and model and correct for youth. But depending only on adults or only on teachers to address the problem puts a lot of responsibility on them for managing often very hectic environments, or sometimes, frankly, teachers who might not understand the dynamics and the experience. Three things that parents in our work have shared with us that have been helpful. So I share this because you might be talking with parents or be a parent yourself that are looking for things. What have other parents said have been helpful for them? The first is helping their child write a letter to the, in this case, teacher or principal, but if that's only obviously if it's in a school context. And I'll show you in a handout on the next page that I got from prevnet.ca that I use, like a structured form to complete that helps a child put in a safe way their experience down on paper. And that can be copied and handed. The reason why parents also like that is because it provides a paper trail. And when they feel like the schools aren't doing enough, or these are repeated and chronic factors, it is quite powerful to come in with a duotang of documented experiences. And the third is importance of that is that it saves the child from having to retell the same painful story again and again and again. Because if we just walk in and a parent says, tell your teacher what you told me, the next step is that the teacher might say, I take this seriously, let's involve the principal. Billy, now tell the principal what you told your parent and told me, and so on, right? So this can help with the communication and take away from that continued relived experience that the child might be going through. The next important thing is to follow up with the teacher or principal with whatever initiatives are suggested by the authorities in that environment. An important strategy is to ask, when can I check back with you about this? I'm going to ask you, I want a date, and we're going to put a date down, and I'm going to follow up with you about this. And who is going to be involved in making this happen? What's the team that's going to be doing this? It's not just on you, Vice Principal. Who is going to be involved? What are their names? And I want to make sure that I have this on paper. And the third is to provide concrete steps for the authority figures in that environment. And again, I'll show you some handouts of things that people can do that are very kind of it's just takeaways. Many people already have these. So it's not like we've invented them. They've been in circulation for a long time. Again, these are what parents often say have been helpful. Here's an example. It's a bit kind of zeroed in, so you might have a hard time. I can't even read it without my glasses right now, but the importance here, what you can see is that there's a lot of fill in the blanks. And there's a lot of check marks that you can use. I've been bullied, I've bullied, or I've seen other being bullied, right? So it says, I have a serious problem. I'm trying to make it stop, and you document the amount of time that they've been trying to make it stop for. And then it allows you to check as many of those boxes. So for an autism experience, one might have other, backhanded bullying and, using absurd information as other check marks or other, and being able to fill in the blank if the physical, verbal, social, cyber don't fit the bill. The importance isn't to be accurate, it's to represent that person's story. And then you can see the next things about how they feel, things that they've tried already, which is very useful to document because kids have tried things. And the worst things we can do is to say, have you tried talking? Why don't you go talk to your teacher? When they feel like they have tried talking to their teacher and it hasn't been helpful. So document the things that have not been, they've tried before, and things they'd like to see differently as the I would like, right, in a place to sign it. So I've adapted this depending on a kid's developmental level. It doesn't have to look this way. You can actually have ones that are much more sophisticated in language, ones that are much more visual in nature and have less language, ones that have no kind of fill in the blanks at all, but instead are just check marks, right? And which provides a very concrete way of responding, so there doesn't have to be that open-ended aspect. The whole point is to use a structure like this. When you are working with or talking to a child or debriefing with somebody about victimization, and you're looking at a form, it takes a lot of the heat off of that individual to go back into themselves, to have to recall every aspect of it. That externalization makes it feel a lot more safe. So I'm a huge fan of filling out some aspect of a form, and this becomes that paper trail. There are a number of other strategies that people have suggested. The first is, Carol Gray has suggested a number of these. The first is to consider creating a visual map for the autistic person of the high and low risk aspects of the environment. So for example, at school, to have like a table, it doesn't have to actually be a map of the school, but a graphical way of identifying, a visual way of identifying the risky areas or the places and the times where it's happening. So you can imagine like a schedule of morning, lunch, afternoon, or you could be more specific than that, hourly, whatever works. And then you could have different areas of the school, like primary class, reset, outside, lunchroom, and so on. And you could actually identify, where is this happening with a number of check marks, where isn't it happening? And that helps to, again, communicate the experience of the risk locations and help with supervision. Creating a safety system around the child is another recommendation. And this could be a lot of people, including peers, but these are people who are responsible for helping that child feel safe in that environment. A third strategy is to support that child in terms of how they communicate their experiences. Of course, coming from Carol Gray, there's a lot of suggestion around social stories and creating a social story to do this. I think the most important takeaway is whatever works for that child, to empower them to be able to talk about their experiences, whether it's through augmentative or alternative communication, whether it's through diary, whether it's through the forms we've talked about. Allow them that support to talk or share their experience in some way. A very concrete strategy that I often use in one-on-one counseling is to come up with a parachute plan, what can you think, say, and do when this happens again, now that we've talked about bullying. Right. Sometimes you have to first go through what is bullying versus teasing and explore that and get a good picture of what it looks like for that person. But the next time you're aware that this is happening, what are the things you can think to yourself? What are the things you can say out loud? Right. Because people are expecting a response, or I guess text. Right. And what can you do? That's adaptive. And this isn't to stop bullying from ever happening again. This is to help somebody be safe in those moments of victimization. And lastly, it's to find developmentally appropriate educational materials around bullying, which you can find at parent books or at other places. There's a lot of work, even some literature that autistic people have developed for other autistic people that talks about bullying. So, but again, it has to fit with that person's developmental level. Here's an example of one of those kind of things, that the handouts that can be done, that exists from prevnet.ca, and you can find a lot of other resources on there and other kind of anti-bullying or healthy relationship websites. But you can see this is one that if you're trying to explore with a child or a teen, things that they've already tried and things they haven't considered yet, I might sit down with them and say, here's a list of commonly used things. This is common. It's not just around you. I know you've done some of these, like you've tried this one, and this one, and they haven't worked. Any other ones on here that you think might be helpful when you're experiencing this? Oh, what about, okay, these two don't seem to make sense for you. Makes sense. But in a sampling way, just explore the different options. Keep that window open. Keep that hope there that there are other things that we can try. There's versions of this, not just for the person being bullied, but for perpetrators of bullying, as well as for bystanders, as well as for the adults in that environment. So you could, if you're in a primary care setting and bullying is something that you're frequently exposed to, you could create a duotang essentially of handouts that are specific to different bullying kind of audiences, and hand those out if that's the very least you can do, right? If these are coming from very respected sites, that can be a helpful strategy. The last thing I'll say before we kind of open it up for discussion is I want to underscore the importance of resilience and care, because we're not going to be able to address all of the experiences of bullying that occur and the experiences of victimization. And we know that in autistic people, there's high rates of interpersonal violence victimization, not just in childhood, but well into adulthood, including highly traumatic experiences. So when I think about bullying, what I think about is victimization. When I think about victimization, I think about trauma. And when I think about trauma, I think about the important contextual experiences that are needed to support that person's well-being. They're never going to, the trauma's happened, but how do we help them maintain or develop some degree of resilience to that trauma? Right? And for some autistic people, the bullying might not be that chronic, although we do know that more frequent bullying is related to more adverse experiences, emotional experiences. Even one, they might have one experience and they might be reliving that again and again and again. Right? So what can we do? Well, one thing that we and others outside of the autism kind of research field have looked at, and they've looked at it in far more eloquent experimental detail than I have, is the importance of family climate and family warmth. And we know that there's a correlation between the degree of positive parental affect that's expressed about and within a family environment, and sibling warmth within a family environment, and the relationship between bullying and internalizing conditions in that victim. So the more positive there is, those kind of expressions of warmth, the weaker the relationship between the frequency of victimization and the adverse kind of internalizing symptomatology, right? So others have looked at this in pretty eloquent twin studies outside of the autism world. They've even looked at interactions between family climate and genetic predispositions to kind of anxiety disorders within the context of bullying. And again, what they seem to highlight is that if we can support family functioning, family communication patterns, family distress and family stress levels, family health and well-being, even if we can't address the bullying, we're going to help that child emotionally in the face of this kind of trauma. So lastly, bullying is addressable. I think it's a critical experience to continue to talk about for autistic people. And this is something that can be intervened. I haven't talked about prevention strategies here, but there's a whole other literature about what to do before bullying happens at all to address climates where perpetration occurs. But certainly what I've talked about here is after identified victimization experiences. And we all have a role to play. It's just our roles are going to be different. Here's my prerequisite kind of contact information, which I think in today's day and age is actually kind of moot. But thank you for kind of chiming in today, and I'm happy to kind of chat over the next while.